Hi, this is Lyle Levitt welcoming you to TribFest 23. I hope you're enjoying this weekend of big ideas and important conversations about the future of our state and our country. No matter who you are or what you believe, please be courteous and respectful to everyone around you. And no matter where you call home, thank you for being here. That's right, even if you're not from Texas, the Texas Tribune Festival wants you anyway.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Svitek, and I'm the Texas Tribune's primary political correspondent. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, I am delighted to welcome you to the annual Texas Tribune Festival and to today's event, one-on-one with Texas Senator Ted Cruz. We have some housekeeping notes before we begin. My conversation with Senator Cruz will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll take audience questions for the following 10 to 15 minutes or so. If you'd like to submit a question, please go to texastribune.org/ask or use the QR code that will eventually, I think, be on the screen behind us. These questions will be moderated by Texas Tribune staff who will read them for us to answer here on the stage. Another reminder, please silence your cell phones, and for those who'd like to tweet, the hashtag is TribFest23. I think we're all familiar with Senator Cruz, but just a quick intro. A former Solicitor General of Texas, Ted Cruz has represented the state in the U.S. Senate since 2012. He is currently the ranking member on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. He was reelected to a second term in 2018, and he is running for a third term next year, and we're going to talk all about it. Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Patrick, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Let's break the ice with a non-controversial topic, Ken Paxton's impeachment. I know that you guys had a busy week in Washington, but here in Austin we saw the continued fallout from the Senate's decision to acquit Attorney General Paxton. You have been a political supporter of his in the past. You opposed his impeachment in the House, and I think I saw a tweet from you celebrating his acquittal. Give me just quickly some broader thoughts on what you saw.
Well, sure. My take on it, which I said publicly at the front end, is that objectively on the merits, Ken Paxton has built a record as the strongest conservative state attorney general in the country. And I think he's substantively done a good job in the position of AG. Secondly, Ken obviously has legal problems that have been pending for a while. And what I said is the court systems are there. They can work that out. There's a process for adjudicating that. And as for the specific allegations that were raised that were the basis of the impeachment, virtually all of that information was before the voters. And we just had an election where Ken had multiple primary opponents who the principal ground that they ran on was these allegations, and the voters ended up deciding to overwhelmingly reelect Ken Paxton. And so what I urged the legislature to do was respect the will of the voters, that the voters had this information, they made a judgment, and I thought the legislature should have respected that judgment. You know the AG's office well, as I noted in my intro. Regardless of whether you thought impeachment was the right tool to try to hold Ken Paxton accountable, have you been troubled at all by the allegations, specifically that those whistleblowers brought forward in 2020? Listen, I think there's a process to resolve them. To be honest, I've got a lot of fights in Washington, D.C., so I have not been focusing closely on the day-to-day. I was not riveted watching the impeachment proceedings in Austin. It's crazy enough in D.C. that was not my principal focus. I will say I'm worried about the aftermath in that I don't want to see a Republican civil war break out. There are obvious tensions between various players on opposite sides of that impeachment. And I think it is not healthy for the state. I don't think it's healthy for the Republican Party, but I think it's also bad for Texas if we have multiple elected Republicans just firing cannons at each other and engaging in retribution. So my hope, there are a lot of pretty hot emotions on both sides of this divide. My hope is everyone will just count to 10, breathe, and focus on delivering for the people of Texas. And in particular, I think this year is the best opportunity of your and my lifetime for the state legislature to pass a real and serious school choice program, to provide every child in Texas with hope and access to an excellent education. Texas, unfortunately, lags behind on school choice. I am a passionate defender of school choice. I've spent 30 years fighting for school choice. I think it is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And you know, people who've gotten a good education can laugh at that, but you know, it's interesting. If you go into the inner cities and you ask African-American parents, you ask Hispanic parents, do they support school choice? 60, 70, 80% of them support it. So I get in Austin, when folks have money and they feel quite comfortable, that they can oppose choice. But my view is, don't trap kids. And here's my point on the Paxton fight. I hope the political disagreements that we see playing out in Austin don't get in the way of Texas stepping forward and leading on school choice. This is an opportunity that's too important.
And there'll be a special, as I'm sure you know, a special legislative session on that coming up next month. One last question on the Paxton matter. One of the political fallouts we've seen inside the Republican Party is Paxton making increasing noise about maybe running against John Cornyn in 2026. I know that's a far time ahead, but it's a big topic in Austin this week. I remember, I think at TribFest a few years ago, you and Senator Cruz appeared together. You guys did a dual endorsement. He endorsed you for 2018. Is he going to have your back as long as he's running for re-election in 2026? Or are you going to have his back?
Look, I'm focused on 2024. We got an election right now. The last thing that I have any interest in doing is speculating years in the future about races that may or may not happen. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, so for a question after the 2024 election. Got it. Well, let's talk about that then. You are up for a third term. It was closer than expected last time when Democrat Beto O'Rourke came within 3 points of defeating you. How are you working to ensure that this time is different? Because that result put a lot of Texas Republicans on edge. So what's changing this time in terms of the message, the strategy?
Well, listen, Texas is a battleground, and I'll tell you, we are taking this Senate re-election deadly seriously. My last re-election, as you noted, 6 years ago, was at the time, it was the most expensive Senate race in U.S. history. And we were outraised, we were outspent 3-1. And what happened with that, we saw tens of millions of dollars flood into the state. And with that money, the Democrats more than doubled Democrat turnout in the state of Texas. They increased Democrat turnout from 1.8 million to 4 million. I think half of those are here in this room today. That's okay, we're in Austin. We saw that happening. That was unprecedented, that kind of massive turnout. And so we leaned in on the other side, and we drove Republican turnout from 2.8 million up to 4.2 million. And so I won by 0.2. I won by 200,000 votes out of more than 8 million votes cast. That was a very close election. And given that, Chuck Schumer has already made clear that I'm his #1 target in the country. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to spend, you're going to see Democrats spend $100 million in the state of Texas, and at some level it's not rocket science. If you are a partisan Democrat, after Donald Trump, there's nobody in the country you want to beat more than me. And so I'm surprised I didn't get a cheer. That's called playing to the audience, heck. So we're going to see a serious fight, but at the end of the day, I believe we're going to win this race.
So to answer the question, I asked, what's going to be different this time? You said deadly serious. Well, in the off year last cycle, you didn't talk about Beto O'Rourke at all, right? It was 2017. You made a decision not to really engage with him until after the primary, if I recall correctly. I've seen you tweet a little bit about Congressman Allred, his crowd size at his events. Are you taking them more seriously this time around, whether it's Congressman Allred, Senator Gutierrez?
Well, look, I will say there's a crowded Democrat primary. There are 4, 5, 6 Democrats who are running. So I don't know who's going to win the Democrat primary. Frankly, I'm agnostic. I figure it'll be Democrat primary voters that'll make that decision. But at the end of the day, I'm not terribly worried about who wins it, because whoever wins it, the Democrats could nominate a ham sandwich, and they're going to raise $100 million to run against me. And I understand that. Listen, we live in a polarized time. We live in an angry time. It's one of the unfortunate dynamics that the two sides don't talk to each other very much, that we spend a lot of time yelling at each other, insulting each other. And by the way, we live in isolated echo chambers. So the left listens to left-wing media, the right listens to right-wing media. On social media, if someone disagrees with you, you unfriend them. And so everything you hear is a constant echo chamber. So I want to actually take a point to thank everyone who's here who doesn't agree with me, who's left of center, who came in with preconceived ideas. You may leave with those ideas reinforced, or you may change your mind on something, but I appreciate coming in and listening and being part of a conversation with someone you don't necessarily agree with. I think we need a lot more of that.
Speaking of people you don't disagree with, I've seen you talking about some bipartisan wins, as you call them, this year, especially since you became ranking member. There was I think it was an NBC News article about this in the spring, and the headline was, "Eyeing re-election, Ted Cruz seeks to burnish a bipartisan image." And I heard in this story, I've been working with Maria Cantwell, Joe Manchin, Raphael Warnock, but it also included this bit from Brian Schatz, and I want to make sure I get this right. NBC said he literally rolled his eyes when asked about you being bipartisan. You're obviously known as a conservative fighter, so make the case to me and to the audience why this is a genuine interest in being bipartisan, and what are some of the examples of the...
Well, listen, I would point to substance and result. What I've done for 11 years is two things. Number one, lead the fight against bad ideas and bad policy that would hurt Texas. And there are a lot of bad ideas and bad policies, whether it's new taxes, whether it's trillions in new spending, whether it's open borders, whether it is regulations that kill jobs. And I have been leading the fight against all of that. But a second component of it is delivering bipartisan, meaningful wins for the state of Texas, pro-jobs and pro-growth. And in my time in the Senate, and by the way, I've been doing that since the day I arrived. Now in the world of the media, there are narratives that take place at one given time, and so I get that 5, 6 years ago or 10, 11 years ago, that was not a story people were writing. But the first bill I ever passed was my first year in the Senate, and it was a bill, actually it's relevant today, it was a bill to stop Hamid Abu-Dhalabi, who's a known terrorist. He was an Iranian who participated in holding Americans hostage in 1979 and 1980, to prohibit him from coming to the United States. And I introduced that legislation. I got bipartisan support, passed it, Barack Obama signed it into law, and we stopped a known terrorist from coming to the United Nations on a diplomatic passport. One of my other first wins, and this is going back to first year or two in office, dealt with Fort Hood. And Fort Hood, you'll recall, Nidal Hassan murdered 14 innocent souls, murdered them in cold blood. And unfortunately, the Obama administration denied giving those service members who were murdered or who were injured the Purple Heart, that they refused to recognize that that was international terrorism. Instead, they called it workplace violence. And I introduced legislation to mandate that those servicemen and women receive the Purple Heart. This was in a Democrat Senate with Harry Reid having the majority. I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We got bipartisan support for my amendment. It passed into law. It was signed into law. And I was down in Fort Hood when 5 years after the fact, those servicemen and women received the Purple Heart. So those were two of the very first bills I passed into law. Now, what I will say, Patrick, in the 11 years that I've been there, I passed 94 different provisions into law that I authored, 94 different bills that made a real difference for the people of Texas. And let me highlight just a couple.
Let me ask you about just one of them. More recently.
Yeah.
Got a lot to get to here, obviously. One of those was, I believe it was Mark Kelly. There was an amendment this year to the NDAA.
Yes.
The goal was to remove, I believe, environmental review, permitting hurdles in the chip manufacturing process. I think you've already gotten asked about this, but you voted against the CHIPS Act.
I did.
You said that you still want to help with the implementation of what it's aiming to do. Explain how you square those two positions.
Well, sure. This is where the details matter. So if you look at national security in our economy, one of the great areas of vulnerability we have is the manufacture of advanced semiconductors. We are enormously dependent on foreign nations, on China, on Taiwan. We have far too little domestic manufacturing capacity for advanced semiconductors. That makes our economy vulnerable. It makes our national security vulnerable. Just about every weapon system we have relies on those advanced semiconductors. And so I have long been a leading voice for bringing our supply chain back to America, bringing that manufacturing back to America. Now, in the last Congress, when we took up the CHIPS Act, there were two different bills. There was one bill called the FABS Act. There was another bill called the CHIPS Act. The FABS Act I was a co-sponsor of and an enthusiastic supporter of. What the FABS Act did is it reduced the regulatory burdens that were on building a new fabricating plant for semiconductor manufacturing. I thought that was a great idea. I enthusiastically supported it. The FABS Act ended up being combined with the CHIPS Act. What the CHIPS Act did was spend tens of billions of dollars of federal taxpayer money in direct subsidies to U.S. corporations to build those plants. I think it's a bad idea to engage in corporate welfare. I think it's a bad idea for the federal government to give taxpayer money to giant corporations, and I think it often leads to corruption. It often leads to cronyism. And so when the two were combined, I voted against the combined bill because I don't like the idea of giving taxpayer money directly to giant corporations.
Would you rather see it spurring and incentivizing private investment, or what is?
Sure. No, that's exactly right. It's why I thought the FABS Act was a much better approach, which is reduce the regulatory burden and let private investment dollars pick the right projects. Part of it is because when you have the government writing checks, you get things like, if you remember Solyndra, you get things where you end up having checks go based on who's got a buddy in the White House rather than on merit. Now, once the CHIPS Act passed into law, and we've got now tens of billions of dollars going out, my job right now, I am the ranking member, the senior Republican, on the Senate Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation. That has jurisdiction over about 40% of the U.S. economy. Once the money's going out, a big part of my job is to make sure that it goes out fairly, that it goes out based on objective standards, on merit, and not on political patronage or cronyism. And I have every bit of confidence that if it goes out based on merit, Texas is going to get a very significant share based on what's coming out here. Now, the bill you referenced is a bill that initially came from the House, and it was a bill that was purported to reduce the regulatory burdens, in particular the NEPA environmental review burdens, on building new semiconductor fab plants. That's an objective I agree with. And it was interesting. You had a lot of Democrats who suddenly were realizing, holy cow, it's hard to build one of these plants with all the federal regulations in place. When the bill came over, its lead proponent was Mark Kelly. He's a Democrat from Arizona. And Mark wanted to get it attached to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. In order to do that, because the bill is in the jurisdiction of the Commerce Committee, he needed the sign-off of the chairman, Maria Cantwell, and myself. I looked at the bill, and this again is where details matter. I studied the bill. And the bill, in effect, created a subsidy for blue states. Here's how. What it said is if your state environmental standards are stricter, if they're tougher than the federal standards, then you're exempted from having to comply with the federal standards. What that meant is it was giving an enormous benefit to New York and California, and it was screwing the state of Texas. And so I looked at it and said, okay, you're asking me, are we going to sign off on a bill that helps blue states at the expense of Texas? My answer was hell no. I'm not clearing a bill that hurts the state of Texas. At that point, I told my staff, let's start drafting a bill that does what the press release says, that actually lessens the burdens, the regulatory burdens on building new plants, and that applies fairly to red states and blue states across the board. At that point, Mark Kelly came to me, and Mark said, Ted, can we team up on this? Can we do this together? I really want to get this done. I said, absolutely. And so my team drafted the bill in conjunction with Mark's. We introduced it, and the last day of July that we were in session, the Kelly-Cruz bill passed, and it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Onto the NDAA, and I expect it'll be signed into law by the end of the year.
Got it. Moving on to a few more specific issues. Yeah. One issue that's definitely going to be, at least in the eyes of your opposition, a big issue this election cycle is still abortion rights. Yeah. You celebrated when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year. You called it nothing short of a massive victory for life. Now that this issue is back in the state's hands, we've seen this debate in the Republican Party about whether there needs to be any federal legislation on this. Where do you stand in that debate? Does there need to be any further federal legislation on this, or new federal legislation?
Well, look, my touchstone for this is the Constitution. And if you look at the history of the country, for the first 180 years of our nation's history, the question of abortion was decided by elected state legislatures. It was decided by the people. And everyone has to recognize Abortion is an issue that is deeply divisive. It's an issue that is personal, that is emotional, that people feel very strongly about. And people feel very strongly about it on both sides and on every spot in the spectrum in between. Part of the genius, I think, of our constitutional system is on issues like that are deeply emotional, that are deeply divisive. The Constitution generally leaves those decisions to the elected legislatures. It lets the political process decide that. In the Supreme Court in 1973, when it decided Roe versus Wade, what it said is the voters don't get to decide this anymore. We're going to decide this. We're going to take it out of the democratic process, and 9 unelected judges are going to decree the rules for the entire country. And they said at the time, this will bring people together. Everyone will accept that we were right and they should listen to us. Well, we saw for 50 years enormous division on the question of abortion and strong disagreements. The Supreme Court was wrong when they said their decision would suddenly bring everyone together and accept the court was right. When the court overturned Roe, what it did is it returned it to the democratically elected legislatures. I think that's the right decision. I think that's consistent with our Constitution. Now, what does that mean as a practical matter? It means in big blue states, in states like New York and California, you're going to continue to have essentially no restrictions on abortion, unlimited access to abortion, because that's where the voters of those states are. In redder states, in states like Texas, you will see more significant limitations, and those limitations will vary state by state depending on the values of the citizens of each state. And that's going to be a process. Here in Texas, that's going to play out in Austin. So there's some folks here that don't like the laws in Austin. Well, there's a process to engage in that, and you can go and focus on legislative elections and your state elections and go back and forth. I will say, one of the reasons why I think this is a much better outcome is if the view you like doesn't prevail. Let's say you're in a state where you're pro-choice and it's a more pro-life state, or you're pro-life and it's a more pro-choice state, and your view doesn't prevail today. You have an outlet. You have a path to go forward and engage. If it's just 9 unelected judges decreeing the rules, you don't have any way to get involved with the process. And so I think we will continue to see significant discussion, debate, disagreement through the democratic process, and I think that's how that should be resolved.
So no federal ban. Now you're not hoping for a federal ban, proposing one?
There is no chance of a federal ban, because if you look at the United States Congress, in the Senate, for any legislation to pass, it takes 60 votes. Right now, the position of every single Democrat, so twice the Democrats have taken up a bill, and it's a bill they said was to recodify Roe.
Sure. I get it. You're saying it's not plausible politically right now.
Well, but let me go a little further. So the Democrats said the bill was to codify Roe. And what's interesting, that actually is poll tested. That polls pretty well. But it is not, in fact, what the bill would do. The bill that was voted on in the Senate is a bill that would effectively strike down every single state restriction on abortion. So it would legalize abortion up until the moment of birth. It would legalize partial birth abortion.
Democrats dispute that,
obviously. It would strike down parental notification and parental consent.
Right. Point taken, though. You're saying that.
But I want to say something that's important to understand. If you look at national polling, that view is an extreme and radical view. 9% of Americans agree with that view, and every single Senate Democrat voted for that view. And so the position of Washington Democrats is wildly out of step with where the American people are.
All that being said, you say you're not in the Texas legislature, obviously, but you are a political leader in Texas. Are you like where the Texas legislature has left this issue as of this moment?
Look, I think it's a democratic process that the Texas legislature will continue to debate, and the people of Texas will remain engaged in.
How are the Republicans in the legislature supposed to hear that answer? I mean, is that support for where we're at? Or?
Look, I am pro-life. I believe in defending innocent life. But I also, as with the Ken Paxton issue, am not spending my days engaged in the day-to-day legislative battles in Austin, because Washington, D.C. is a mess. And that's what the people of Texas elected me to do, is to go fight for 30 million people in of Texas in D.C., and so that's what I do.
I want to move on to another topic that has been a huge part of, it was a huge part of the 2022 election cycle in Texas, will be another one this cycle, which is gun violence. There was the last time the University of Texas at Austin asked this question, I think was in June, about the most important issues that Texas voters say they're facing. Number 3 in the most recent poll was, quote, gun control and gun violence. So it's pretty top of mind for voters, at least as of June. Very well aware of your views on gun control, but I want to ask you about one particular proposal. We saw during this legislative session here in Austin, there was a proposal to raise the age to buy semi-automatic rifles from 18 to 21. A Texas House committee did vote it out. 2 Republicans voted for it. We've seen, presumably had the blessing to advance at least to the Republican Speaker of the House. Didn't get a vote on the floor, but it was still viewed as a big moment. What did you think of that? Is that a proposal you could support?
So look, on the question of gun crime and gun violence, this is another issue that is deeply emotional. And unfortunately, when we discuss it, it mostly consists of the 2 sides screaming at each other. I think we ought to actually come together and have a discussion about what works. When it comes to stopping gun violence, I mean, as you read that poll, do you think stopping gun violence is an important priority? I'm a hell yes on that. And I've spent much of my adult life in law enforcement fighting violent crime. And when it comes to violent crime, it is horrific. It is an enormous problem. It's one of the reasons why I also support so strongly the men and women of law enforcement, because if you want to stop violent crime, you need to have a strong and effective police force to stop violent crime. Now, when it comes to gun violence, and in particular mass shootings, listen, Texas has had way too many of them. And I have been on the ground over and over again. So I was there in Uvalde. I was there in Sutherland Springs. I was there in El Paso. I was there in Midland, Odessa. I was there in Dallas. I was there in Santa Fe High School, the morning of the Santa Fe High School shooting. Santa Fe High School is about 45 minutes from my house. I was at home that morning when I got a phone call about what had happened. And so I jumped in a truck. I was down on the campus within about an hour of the shooting. It is horrific. It is terrifying. I say this as a parent. Look, when we were kids, this was not a thing. Nobody worried about some lunatic coming into a school and shooting up kids. And so this is an enormous problem that needs to be addressed. The question is, what actually works to fix it? And here's where, on this topic, the 2 sides yell at each other instead of having a conversation that begins with a simple proposition. Let's start with the proposition that you and I both want to save lives. If we agree with that, then we can have a rational conversation about what policies would accomplish that. If I believe that you just want lots of people to die, or you believe that I want lots of people to die, we're not going to have a conversation. We're just going to yell at each other. If you look at what actually works, what is effective. So when I was first elected to the Senate, it was 2012. Just a few months after that happened, we had the shooting up in Sandy Hook, which was truly horrific. It was one of the first of these mass shootings in a school. And we had a big gun control debate in the Senate at the time. And I introduced legislation at the time. It was called Grassley Cruz. I was a brand new freshman. I wrote the bill. I teamed up with Chuck Grassley, who was the senior Republican on the Judiciary Committee, but I wrote the bill. And it was designed to say, okay, what steps do we know would be effective in stopping gun violence? So it started with targeting the bad guys, targeting the criminals, targeting felons and fugitives and those with serious mental illness, and going after them, prosecuting them when they try to illegally buy guns, prosecuting them and putting them in jail. It directed the Department of Justice conduct an audit of every federal agency to make sure that they have reported criminal convictions to the national database, because many agencies have a very bad record of doing so. Many states do as well. It also had an incentive program for states to report those convictions. Then what it did is created a gun crime task force to go and prosecute felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns and put them in jail. What ended up happening, Patrick, we voted on Grassley Cruz on the Senate floor. He got 52 votes. This is in a Democrat Senate. I got 9 Democrat votes. It got the most bipartisan support of any of the comprehensive legislation that was introduced. but it didn't pass. Why didn't it pass? It didn't pass because Harry Reid and the Democrats filibustered it. They demanded 60 votes. So even though it got 52, which is a majority, that wasn't 60. And the position, unfortunately, that we see in Washington on these debates is repeatedly Democrats in the Senate block legislation that is targeting criminals, that is putting gun criminals in jail.
I know your philosophy on this, and I know that the history of the legislation you're describing. I mean, there's no doubt. I know where you stand on this and what the history is. That raise the age proposal, though.
Oh, yeah.
How do you...
There is zero evidence that proposal works, that it does anything. And look, this is the basic divide. Every time there's a mass shooting, you see elected Democrats, their approach is they want to take away the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. Now see, this is what I mean. We just yell at each other. This is not, there is zero evidence that doing so, there is zero evidence that doing so protects any lives. And in fact, if you look nationally, if you look at the jurisdictions with the strictest gun control laws, almost without exception, they have among the highest murder rates and among the highest crime rates. The city of Chicago has some of the toughest gun control laws in the country, and it consistently has horrible murder rates because what happens? If you pass a law that disarms law-abiding citizens, by definition, they follow the law. The criminals don't. And so what ends up happening is the criminals target the law-abiding citizens. So your question, there are proposals that say, listen, we want to raise the age to buy a firearm to age 21. Well, you know what? I think that a 19 or 20-year-old single mom living in the inner city in Houston or Dallas, going to work in a dangerous neighborhood, has a right to protect herself, has a right under the Second Amendment to protect herself from someone who would commit violence against her. And I'll give a stat, again, look, this is an audience who I think has their mind made up and doesn't want to hear actual data. But let me give you data from a source that I suspect you would agree with, the Obama White House. You're going to agree that's not a right-wing source? Here's what the Obama White House put out. They said every year firearms are used defensively to stop a crime, to stop a murder, to stop a rape, between 500,000 and 1 million times a year, every year in the United States of America. That is a very simple reality. And so when you disarm people, when you take that 19-year-old single mom and you say you can no longer defend yourself, the data show you see crime rates go up, you see murder rates go up, you see sexual assault rates go up. And if you want to stop those crimes, and listen, I believe the people here want to stop those crimes, but if you want to stop them, you should look to the data of what actually works. And what works is putting the criminals in jail. And I'll point out...
Senator, we got to move on to the next question.
But hold on a second.
Make it brief.
This is deeply connected.
Sure, just make it brief, please.
This is deeply connected with the policies Democrats have championed, defunding the police, and also George Soros prosecutors who release violent criminals. Because the same people who are all worked up about gun control are also, by and large, supporting releasing criminals from jail. And we see that pattern over and over and over again. And when it happens, so I've sat down with Texas police chiefs who said to me,
the question.
We know who the trigger pullers are. We know who the criminals are. We want to arrest them, and we can't because they keep getting let go and they keep committing more murders. If you want to stop crime, go after the criminals, not law-abiding citizens.
Let's talk about another big issue that is usually at the top of that list of what voters care about is the border and immigration. Yep. So that's going to be front of mind in this election as well. I want to ask you about one specific thing that's happened here in Texas. I know that we can hit on a bunch of different issues under this umbrella, but one thing that Governor Abbott has done through his efforts here in Texas is he's expanded, at times, commercial vehicle inspections at the border, and it's led to these huge traffic jams at the border. There was an economist who put out an estimate of all the money equivalent in commerce that Texas lost because of this policy. It was a big deal last year when Abbott first did it, but he's brought it back in fits and starts, including this past week, reportedly. As someone who cares about the Texas economy, cares about border infrastructure, I know you're working with Representative Cuellar on that.
Yeah.
Does any of that specific policy that Abbott has trouble you?
Look, Abbott is trying to use whatever tools he can to respond to the crisis and chaos that Washington has created. What's happening at our southern border is truly unprecedented, and you can't really understand it until you see it. I spend a lot of time at the southern border. It is a humanitarian disaster. Now, you asked about trade and commerce across bridges. I am a huge proponent of trade and commerce, and I will say one of the odd things about the Biden administration is they have effectively an open border for people crossing illegally, and at the same time they consistently constrain legal trade and commerce with Mexico, which makes no sense. It's exactly backwards. And your first question about bipartisan wins, there's one that is deeply relevant on exactly this topic, which is in South Texas. There are 4 bridges right now that the people of South Texas are either trying to build or expand existing bridges. So there are 2 in Laredo, there's one in Maverick County, Eagle Pass, there's one in Cameron County down by Brownsville. The Biden administration had been putting regulatory roadblocks in front of all of them, and in particular, the reason is as follows. To build any bridge in America, you have to go through what's called NEPA environmental review. That's true wherever you build a bridge. If you're building a bridge across an international border, you also need a presidential permit if you're crossing a border. The previous policy had been the president would grant that permit contingent on the completion of the NEPA review. When Biden came in, they inverted that. They turned it upside down and they said, we will grant 0 presidential permits unless and until the entire NEPA environmental review is concluded. The effect of that is it delayed every one of these projects 2, 3, 4 years, and it also made it harder to get financing because the sponsors of the bridges found that the banks wouldn't commit until the presidential permit was granted. And so I worked to assemble a bipartisan coalition in South Texas. I teamed up with Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, Monica de la Cruz, a Republican, Vicente Gonzalez, a Democrat, and Tony Gonzalez, a Republican. And all of us together, along with John Cornyn, I wrote a letter that they all joined to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, calling on them to end this bureaucratic delay and end this new rule. The Biden State Department didn't listen, so I introduced legislation to mandate that they expedite these bridge permits. In the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I got bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans. We adopted my legislation, and the last day of July that we were in session, the Senate on the floor passed that legislation with overwhelming bipartisan support. When those bridges are completed, that will mean tens of billions of dollars of new trade and commerce, thousands of new jobs in Texas for farmers, ranchers, manufacturers. That's what we ought to be doing. And I got to say, I don't understand the approach of a Washington Democrat that throttles legal trade and commerce and kills jobs, and that simultaneously allows chaos and open borders for people crossing illegally.
Well, and just to go back to the original question, so you're basically saying you're willing to give Abbott the latitude, including that, because he's dealing with such an unprecedented problem, including the expanded vehicle inspection policy?
Well, yes, and it's a problem that is man-made. This is one of the important things to say. So if you look at press talking points, one of the talking points that you see from the White House is, well, the border is just not solvable. The problem with that is objectively false. When Joe Biden came into office, he inherited the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. And this crisis was caused by 3 specific decisions. Number 1, it was caused the first week in office, Biden immediately halted construction of the border wall. Number 2, he reinstated the failed policy of catch and release so that when people are apprehended, they're given a court date. Sometime in the future, they're let go, and the vast majority of them are never seen again. And number 3, he pulled out of the incredibly successful Remain in Mexico agreement. Now, what was Remain in Mexico? Remain in Mexico was an international agreement the United States negotiated with Mexico that said that when people cross illegally into Mexico, typically from Central or South America, that they would remain in Mexico while their U.S. asylum case was proceeding. And it worked. It worked incredibly well, so much so that we saw the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Biden came in his first week in office. He ripped that agreement to shreds, And we right now have the highest rate ever recorded. 7.2 million people have crossed illegally since Biden became president, and it is utterly indefensible.
Want to move on to one or two topics before we go to audience questions here. This will be your first time facing the voters since 2021, the winter freeze, you going to Cancun during it. I know that you were contrite when that happened. I remember seeing the press conferences. It seems like you make quite a bit of light of it these days, following your Twitter feed, your media appearances. What's going to be your message on that in this campaign? Is it going to be lighthearted, or do you believe that the voters deserve a more serious handling of that matter?
Well, listen, I think it is an interesting thing in the partisan world we have, because there's such a divide that everyone believes caricatures. And so in the world of Twitter, which is a barren wasteland, anyone on the left, their favorite thing to scream at me is "Scream Cancun," usually with some amusing gif of me in cornrows or something, which there's some clever things out there. You know, I got to say that there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy in how the media handled it, in that, you know, Joe Biden has been at the beach week after week after week while Hawaii was on fire, while natural disasters unfolded, and the press has nothing to say about it. The media had a lot of fun pounding me for it. Here's the simple reality, which is every disaster we've had in the state of Texas since I became Senate, I have worked and my team has worked vigorously to help the people of Texas. During that disaster, look, I got to tell you, I don't know how to string power lines. When we had a freeze, when the state was frozen, I don't have the ability to control the weather. I don't have the ability to string power lines. I was at home with my wife and my daughters. Our power was out like everyone else. And so I made a decision to take my kids to the beach. And to be clear, and by the way, lots of other Texans made the decisions if they could go elsewhere to go elsewhere. To be clear, what I was doing in a house with no lights and no power was I was on the phone with other people in the federal government, talking in the federal government. I was doing my job, and you can do that from anywhere. There were multiple other Texas officials who were out of state who nobody cared about at all. But I get, if you've been told Cruz is the devil, then screaming Cancun is a wonderful partisan thing to do. But if at the end of the day your greatest criticism of me is that I took my kids to the beach, I can live with that.
Okay. I think we're getting close to audience questions here. One more question for you. You've become a prolific podcaster. You record a podcast 3 times a week. When I wrote this question a couple days ago, there were 290 episodes, I think, on Apple Music. What do you say to folks who question whether you're able to do your job and also be a low-key media mogul?
You know, I got to say, I find this one of the most bizarre political attacks I've ever seen. As far as I'm concerned, doing the podcast is an integral part of doing my job. My job is to represent 30 million Texans, to fight for 30 million Texans. And 3 days a week, I go on a podcast to talk with Texans and talk with people across the country about what the issues are facing this country, about immigration, about what's happening on our southern border, about terrorism, about crime, about taxes, about regulations, about the fights that are happening in Washington. And I find it really bizarre. You know, Colin Allred apparently has based his entire campaign on the fact that I do a podcast. By the way, I would encourage every one of you, particularly those of you who are left of center, do something crazy. Go download the podcast. Listen to something you don't agree with. And by the way, listen to some left-wing podcasts too. But we ought to actually have, one of the things I do with the podcast, we go on college campuses, do it in front of students. We do 90 minutes of Q&A and take questions. And we have a rule, if you have a hostile question, come to the front of the line. It is integral to talk with the people of Texas and this country about the issues that are facing this country. And I also very much believe Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. Look, I'm fighting for the people of Texas for lower taxes, for lower regulations, for more jobs. And to do that, we've got to persuade the American people. And part of the reason I do the podcast is actually because the corporate media doesn't do its job anymore. It has become so partisan. It has abandoned the role of actually reporting on facts and being neutral. And Patrick, you do a very good job of that. I'm not slamming you when I say that, but I am slamming many of your colleagues who have forgotten what it is like.
I'll stand up for my colleagues.
I know you will, and that's
They do
fine.
a great job,
But listen, part of the reason that I do the podcast, so we have just under 1 million unique listeners every month. We have more people every week who listen to Verdict than CNN. We have big numbers in Texas. Okay. We're beating CNN every week. And the reason... So that's an amusing thing to say, except for the fact that the guy who's making that charge in 6 years in the House has passed one bill. It took 6 years to pass one bill. By the way, also the first 4 years he was in the House, he voted with Nancy Pelosi, not 90% of the time, not 95% of the time, not 99% of the time, 100% of the time. And this is a room that loves Nancy Pelosi, and so it's a great choice. If you want your senator to be Nancy Pelosi, as the people in this room do, then you have a choice. But I will point out that while he was passing one bill, I passed 94 bills. I've traveled to 186 cities across the state of Texas. The podcast typically is recorded. I'm doing Monday's podcast Sunday afternoon. You know when I normally record the podcast? At 11 or 12 o'clock at night, because I typically work 18-hour days. I do it at the end of a day. So that's fine. I understand that just yelling at the TV and being angry doesn't take a lot of energy. But I believe our country is in crisis. I look at what's happening in Washington. It is terrifying, the direction this administration has gone. And so I jump out of bed every day fighting to save this nation. And I think the podcast is an incredibly powerful tool to give people information. And every one of you shaking your heads, just try. But you're not going to do it because we live in a world where people are closed-minded. But I think we would all be better off if we listened to the other side more and actually engaged in real discussions. You know, talking about CNN, on CNN I did 3 debates with Bernie Sanders, one-on-one debates with Bernie Sanders, 90 minutes each, that were some of the best television Bernie has had. Because listen, Bernie and I didn't sit there and insult each other. We didn't call each other an SOB. Bernie is a self-described socialist. He's an unapologetic socialist. I am an unapologetic defender of free enterprise. So we could have a real debate about, okay, what benefits people more? What lifts people out of poverty? What is better for America, socialism or free enterprise? We need more of that discussion that is honest and substantive and engaged, and that's what I spend just about every waking moment of my life doing.
Got it. I think we're going to have a little bit of debate now, going to audience questions. We've got about 14 minutes left. Let's see, I believe we have some TRIB staffers who are here to help us with the audience questions. There we go. Right behind you.
Hi, Senator Cruz. Thank you for being here. Our first question is, you say that about the Ken Paxton impeachment, you said you hope that there is not a GOP civil war that follows it. In the past, you've gotten involved in legislative primaries, runoffs, and things like that. Do you agree with the idea that Republicans who supported Paxton's impeachment should face a primary next year?
That's a clever question. I'm going to stay out of that question. Look, people have a lot of strong emotional views. I'll tell you what I look for in Republican primaries, so you're right. I do engage in primaries, which is unusual. So if you look at the U.S. Senate, there are 100 U.S. senators. To the best of my knowledge, I am the only U.S. senator that engages regularly in primaries in his own state. And there's a reason for it, because doing it is stupid. I am hurting myself. I am deliberately taking on political damage doing so. And why is that? Because when you make an endorsement in a primary, as a general rule, you get about half the person's friends and you get all of their enemies. And so you're ticking people off anytime you get in the middle of a primary. So 99 U.S. senators, by and large, say, no, we stay out of all those primaries, it's easier. I don't, and here's why. I mentioned before about school choice. There's no domestic issue I care more about than school choice. Every 2 years, I sit down with my team, and I have my team compile a spreadsheet. And I look at every vote that the state legislature has taken on school choice. And if you're a state legislator and you have voted in favor of choice, and you are otherwise relatively conservative, you're quite likely to get my support, and I engage in those races and support those candidates. If you voted against choice, the chances of my supporting you are essentially zero. And the odds are significant that I'm going to endorse your primary opponent. And when I endorse, I don't do so gently. I come in, I cut TV, I cut radio, I come in and campaign. So we had 7 runoffs last year where you had on one side candidates who were supporting school choice, on the other side the teachers' unions were funding candidates on the other side, and we went head to head. We won the majority of those, and I do those even though it is politically harmful to me, because A, I'm trying to get the legislature to do the right thing for Texas kids, but B, my hope is that there will also be a carrot and stick. That, look, the impediment to school choice in Texas is not ideological, it is more geographic, in that you have a number of rural Republicans, right, where in their districts the biggest employer is the school system, and the superintendent opposes choice. And I get that. Choice is primarily an urban and suburban solution. What I'm trying to do is create an incentive so if they're looking at the next vote, I want them to say, you know what, I'd rather not have Cruz mess around in my primary. Why don't I just do the right thing? Because I'll tell you, Patrick, before I ran for Senate, something that I told my core team, I said, listen, if when I die, my tombstone says that Ted played a meaningful role in bringing school choice to the kids of Texas and the kids of America, then I will die a happy man.
We know you're passionate about it, bottom line.
I think there's no domestic issue that matters more.
Okay, so it sounds like if you do get involved in a primary this cycle, school choice would be the driving issue,
school choice
not necessarily
is the driving issue, yes.
Got it. Okay, next question.
It was recently revealed that Clarence Thomas participated in donor events, conservative donor events. Do you view this as an ethical violation, and why or why not?
Well, you're right. There has been a concerted media effort attacking Clarence Thomas. Now, people here are laughing about it because I suspect they listen to left-wing sources where that's what they hear. What they probably don't hear is the data that what Clarence Thomas is accused of doing was also done by most of the other justices, including left-wing justices. So there was lots of focuses on Clarence Thomas flew on a plane, Clarence Thomas flew on a plane of a billionaire, Clarence Thomas flew on a plane of a billionaire to some event. Well, you know who also did that? Ruth Bader Ginsburg did that. You know who also did that? Stephen Breyer did that. You look at Anthony Kennedy did that. Sandra Day O'Connor did that. And the way the media has attacked this issue has been utterly hypocritical and one-sided. The people going after Clarence Thomas hate Clarence Thomas because, number one, they hate his jurisprudence, but there's a particular hatred that the left has for a black man who dares to be a conservative. And I will tell you the contempt that is heaped upon Clarence Thomas. Compare it to Antonin Scalia. I knew Antonin Scalia well. I know Justice Thomas well. Both were very conservative. But yet the left didn't insult and vilify Scalia the way they do Thomas. And I'll tell you, look, I'm an Hispanic man. And the left's view, they think any Hispanic in this country, how dare you? You must be a leftist. To any black person in this country, you say you must be a leftist. As Joe Biden said, if you're not voting Democrat, you ain't black. Well, you know what? That's not something someone says. I'm actually going to ratchet back from my true sentiments on that, but it's not difficult to figure out.
Just to do a quick follow on that, though. If other justices are doing it, I mean, do you support stronger ethics rules for the whole court?
Look, I think it is reasonable to have ethics standards on the court across the board as long as they're fairly applied. Now, that being said, I serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee have zero interest in examining and applying the same standards to the justices they agree with. This is part of politicizing the court. This is part of the left has engaged in an ongoing effort to demonize and vilify the court that included Chuck Schumer standing on the steps of the Supreme Court and saying if the court overturned Roe versus Wade that they would, quote, unleash the whirlwind. And he threatened the court on the steps of the court. He said, you won't know what hit you. And I will tell you, some of the most shameful actions of the Biden DOJ have concerned angry and violent protesters at the home of the justices that have been there night after night after night. There's a federal statute that makes it a crime to protest at the home of a judge. The Biden DOJ won't enforce that. And by the way, the angry rhetoric was so extreme that a deranged leftist flew from California to Maryland to murder Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He came with a gun, a knife, and duct tape to his home, and yet still, I've questioned Merrick Garland repeatedly in Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, why won't you enforce this law? And he stubbornly refuses to enforce the law because the Democrats are willing to try to threaten and intimidate justices, and I think that's very bad for the rule of law.
Next question, Watkins.
All right, Senator, you have been a strong supporter of term limits at times and have introduced legislation seeking to limit U.S. senators to 2 terms. Why then are you running for a 3rd term?
I am an emphatic supporter of term limits. Every term in Congress, I have introduced a constitutional amendment to limit members of Congress, to limit senators to 2 terms, to limit members of the House to 3 terms. I believe Washington would work much, much better with term limits. In fact, in the Senate, I chaired a hearing when I was chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee, the Judiciary Committee, on term limits, trying to push my amendment. What I have never said from day one is that I was going to unilaterally term limit myself when the other 99 are not. And you can laugh at that, but I'm in favor of a structural reform that is applied to everyone. If there were a button right here to throw all 100 senators out of the Senate, I would push the button and happily go get a job in the private sector. I think Washington would be better off if we threw all the bums out. That being said, I'm going to keep fighting for term limits that apply to everyone, and I will eagerly and enthusiastically comply with the rules as everyone else does, but I don't think you should have an uneven playing field where only one side is bound by it and the other side is not.
All right, next question.
Thank you. So you mentioned listening to other viewpoints early in the talk. What are you doing to listen and incorporate those viewpoints yourself? And a follow-up question that was included in this is, who's your favorite Democrat to work with in the Senate?
So those are great questions. Look, I spend a lot of time, number one, in the Senate, engaged in committee hearings, engaged with my colleagues, working with my colleagues, debating with my colleagues. I spend a lot of time also reading what people who disagree with me think on Twitter. Look, I engage in Twitter a lot, and I think Twitter is a wonderful forum for immediate debates. And I'll mention, look, one issue that got kind of heated here earlier was gun control, and I'll tell an anecdote of engaging with the left several years ago, where Alyssa Milano, the Hollywood actress and left-wing activist, tweeted out, she said to me, she said, "Ted, where in the Bible does it say that there's a God-given right to own a gun?" And listen, I could have responded in a smart alecky way. I could have responded a lot of ways, but I decided to engage it substantively. And I sat there and sent out, I think it was about a 10-part tweet thread, where I said, well, listen, of course the Bible doesn't reference owning a gun. Firearms weren't invented at the time the Bible was written. The Bible does talk about the right to life, and the Bible also talks about the right to self-defense. And in particular, in the Old Testament, it says, if someone comes into your house at night and you take their life, it is not murder, but if you take their life in the daytime, it is. And that's not talking about the time of day. It's talking about if someone is invading your home, you have a right to defend yourself and defend your family. And then I did, in a series of tweets, talked about the history in the civil rights movement of racists trying to disarm African Americans in particular so they could be subject to violence. And I put this out there, and she came back to me and said, well, you wouldn't dare debate this with me in person. And I said, absolutely I would. And I said, you're welcome to come to my office. She came to my office, and we live streamed it. You can watch it. It's about a 90-minute debate where Alyssa Milano and I debated gun violence. And I started that the same way I did here, where I said, listen, can we start with the assumption that we both would like to save lives? If either of us just think death is the objective of the other person, we won't have a discussion. But if we can say what steps actually work to save more lives, that's great. So I try to engage a lot with people who disagree with me. I also mentioned on the podcast, I go to college campuses and take questions. I love questions from people who disagree, to have a respectful engagement. Now, you asked what Democrats I like to work with. You know, it's kind of funny. In the 2020 Democrat presidential primary, there were 3 Democrats running for president, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Cory Booker, who all used the same joke. They said, heck, I even worked with Ted Cruz, which in a Democrat primary, that's a laugh line. All of them got laughs on that. All of them I have worked with closely. Gillibrand and I worked very, very closely together, number one, to change how sexual assault is prosecuted in the military, and in particular to move the decision to prosecute sexual assault from outside the chain of command to a professional military prosecutor. That's something. She was the lead Democrat, I was the lead Republican, and we fought for years to get that done. And I'll mention something else that Kirsten and I did together that I'm really proud of, is a bill called the Cadet Act. And the Cadet Act concerns our service academies, the young men and women that are at our military service academies. And for many years, they had a policy in place that was wildly unfair and made no sense. Their policy was that if a female cadet gets pregnant, that she has three and only three choices: that she can have an abortion against her wishes, that she can go to court and give up her parental right to her child legally, or number three, she could withdraw from the service academy and pay the federal government back the cost of all the education she'd gotten before. That policy made no sense. It was idiotic. And so I teamed up with Kirsten Gillibrand. We authored a bill called the Cadet Act. It was Cruz Gillibrand. It passed in December of last year with bipartisan support. And now that policy has changed. And I'll tell you, when I sit down with West Point cadets, every year you'd have 4, 5, 6 cadets this applied to. And some of them would have an abortion even though they didn't want to. Others, a lot of them would terminate their parental rights. And then after they graduate, they go back to court and try to adopt their own child. And it was asinine. It was a nice example about how, look, on the question of abortion, Kirsten and I disagree a lot. But on this issue, that it ought to be the moms making the decision to keep their kids. And when you have young women who want to serve our nation and defend our nation, who also want to be moms, that's a wonderful thing. And so that's a victory that was really significant.
We are out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't. You did mention 2020 presidential primary. Let's wrap it up on this question. Are you still staying out of the 2024 Republican presidential primary?
I am indeed. I am Switzerland.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Senator Cruz, for participating. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man.